The Senate Banking Committee hearing room fell into an unnatural silence as Tim Scott leaned forward, adjusting his microphone with the calm confidence of a man who believed he was in control. His voice cut through the air sharply, measured but unmistakably pointed, the kind of tone that signaled this wasn't going to be another routine exchange for the cameras. "Vice President Harris," he began, his eyes locked across the room, "you talk a lot about helping communities, but what have you actually done, besides making noise in speeches and on social media?" The question landed like a strike of thunder. Staffers froze mid-typing. Reporters looked up from their laptops. Even seasoned committee members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. This wasn't standard political disagreement. This was a calculated challenge, delivered live, under the bright lights of C-SPAN, with millions watching. And what Tim Scott didn't yet realize was that he had just stepped directly into a moment that would reshape both of their public narratives. Across the room sat Kamala Harris, composed, still, unreadable. She didn't react immediately, no visible frustration, no defensive posture, just a slight pause, and then a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile that makes opponents uneasy, because Kamala Harris wasn't surprised. She had seen this coming. What Scott assumed was a spontaneous jab was, in reality, the release of weeks of tension that had been quietly building beneath the surface of Washington politics, and Harris had been preparing for this exact moment long before the cameras started rolling. This wasn't just about policy. It wasn't even about ideology. It was about who gets to speak for Black America and how. The hearing itself had started like dozens before it. Dry testimony, technical language about banking regulations and community development financial institutions, the kind of procedural discussion that rarely breaks into the public consciousness, but beneath that surface calm, a political fault line was already cracking. For weeks, Kamala Harris had been openly critical of Republican-led economic approaches that she argued disproportionately harmed Black and working-class communities. In a widely circulated interview just days earlier, she had laid out point by point how certain voting records, including Scott's, stood in direct opposition to the outcomes they publicly claimed to support. Scott's office had responded with statements, then counter-statements, then silence, until now. What made the moment explosive wasn't just what Scott said, it was how he said it. The tone wasn't curiosity, it was dismissal. The subtle implication that Harris's influence came more from visibility than substance, and in Washington, those implications are never accidental. Scott, the highest-ranking Black Republican in the Senate, had built his political brand on being measured, composed, and unimpeachable. Born in North Charleston, South Carolina, he had risen through the ranks by presenting himself as proof that conservative values and Black leadership were not mutually exclusive. To his supporters, he was the voice of reason. To critics, he was something else entirely. They argued that Scott had grown comfortable serving as the Republican Party's shield, used to deflect criticism, soften rhetoric, and legitimize policies that disproportionately impacted communities of color. That tension had followed him for years, and now it was sitting across from him in the form of the Vice President of the United States. Kamala Harris represented a very different political lineage, a former prosecutor, a former Attorney General, a former U.S. Senator, and now Vice President. Her career hadn't been built on appeasement or symbolic presence. It had been forged in courtrooms, hearings, and political battles where preparation wasn't optional. It was survival. She understood power. She understood narrative, and she understood timing. What Scott miscalculated was assuming that seniority alone would give him the upper hand. The room felt heavier by the second. Harris remained silent, listening, letting Scott continue. And emboldened by that silence, he pressed further. "I've been in Congress for over a decade," he added, leaning back slightly. "I've passed real legislation. I've worked on real solutions, but all I see from you are headlines and applause lines. Where's the substance?" Now he had crossed from critique into condescension. Veteran lawmakers knew the danger of that shift. Questioning policy is one thing, questioning legitimacy, especially publicly, is another. The chairman attempted to interject, but Scott waved it off. "No, this matters," he said. "The people deserve leaders who are focused on results, not performance." Around the room, aides exchanged looks. Republican staffers typed furiously. Democratic aides stiffened, sensing the moment tipping into something far more consequential than Scott intended. Social media, meanwhile, was already lighting up. Clips were spreading in real time. Commentators took sides instantly. Hashtags began climbing. What few realized was that Harris's silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. She had spent years in rooms exactly like this, rooms where men spoke over her, questioned her credentials, and assumed she'd retreat under pressure. She never did. As Scott spoke, Harris quietly set her notes aside. She didn't look down. She didn't break eye contact. And when she finally leaned toward her microphone, The room felt the shift immediately. The air changed. Not with anger, but with certainty. This wasn't going to be a reaction. It was going to be a response. And as the committee room waited, unaware of how sharply the moment was about to turn, one thing was already clear. Tim Scott had asked a question he wasn't ready to hear answered. The committee room remained frozen in anticipation as Kamala Harris leaned forward, her posture calm, deliberate, almost surgical. This was not the body language of someone caught off guard. This was the posture of someone stepping into a moment she understood completely. Before she spoke, she let the silence breathe. It was a silence that made people uncomfortable, the kind that forces everyone in the room to realize they're about to witness something they won't be able to rewind. Then she began. "Well, Senator Scott," Harris said evenly, her voice steady but unmistakably firm, "since you've questioned my substance, let's talk about it." The room stiffened. This wasn't a rebuttal yet. It was an invitation, one Scott had no way of declining. Harris didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush her words. She spoke with the precision of someone who knew every sentence would be replayed, dissected, and remembered. "You mentioned results," she continued. "So let's be very clear about what that means." She paused, eyes locked directly on Tim Scott. "In my first year as vice president, I worked directly on expanding access to small business capital in underserved communities. Efforts that resulted in billions of dollars reaching entrepreneurs who had been systematically locked out of traditional lending systems." Scott's expression tightened slightly. Harris wasn't listing achievements for applause. She was establishing a record, and doing it methodically. "I've spent decades working on criminal justice reform, from inside courtrooms to the halls of Congress," she continued, "not as a talking point, as work." The word work lingered in the air. Then she shifted. "And since we're discussing social media," Harris said, her tone sharpening just enough to signal the turn, "let's address the implication behind that comment." A few heads lifted instantly. "You seem to believe that visibility somehow replaces substance," she said. "But what you're really criticizing is access, communication, reach." Harris leaned back slightly, not retreating, resetting. "When people see a speech online, when they hear policy explained in language they actually understand, that isn't performance, that's leadership." Now Scott attempted to respond, opening his mouth slightly, but Harris continued without missing a beat. "I'm not finished." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried weight precisely because they were controlled. "Before we continue, pause for a moment and think about what you're watching unfold. This isn't just another political argument. It's a collision of experience, preparation, and power. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how far these moments travel." Harris resumed without acknowledging the interruption because within the story there hadn't been one. "You questioned what I've done," she said, "so let me answer you directly." She glanced down briefly, not to search for words, but to confirm facts she already knew. "In the last 12 months alone, my office has worked with state and local governments to expand broadband access in rural and urban communities that private markets ignored. We've helped secure funding for job training initiatives tied directly to industries that are hiring now, not hypotheticals." The contrast was becoming unmistakable. Scott had launched an abstract critique. Harris was responding with specifics. "And since you mentioned communities struggling with poverty, crime, and education," she added, "I find it interesting that you'd question my commitment while consistently voting against policies designed to address those exact challenges." Now the room leaned in. This was the moment where debate turns into exposure. "You voted against expanding Medicaid," Harris said calmly, "against raising the minimum wage, against student debt relief, policies that would have directly benefited black families in your own state." The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. Scott shifted in his chair. Harris didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply continued, her tone almost instructional. "You speak often about personal responsibility," she said, "but leadership also requires institutional responsibility, and voting records matter." There it was, not an insult, not a personal attack, a mirror. And mirrors are far more dangerous than accusations. Scott attempted to interject again, his voice rising slightly, but Harris held the floor effortlessly. "You've spent years presenting yourself as a bridge," she said, "but bridges have to connect to something meaningful. Otherwise, they're just structures people talk about without ever crossing." A few audible breaths escaped around the room. Staffers stopped typing. This was no longer a committee hearing. It was a reckoning. "And I'll say this plainly," Harris continued. "Questioning my qualifications doesn't make your record stronger. It only draws attention to it." Scott's confidence, the same confidence he'd carried into the room, had visibly eroded. The cameras caught it. The internet would too. Harris finished her response not with volume, but with finality. "So, yes, Senator," she said, leaning back slightly, "I'm visible, I'm vocal, And I'm effective. And I won't apologize for any of it. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that signals something irreversible has just happened. The chairman cleared his throat, unsure how to reclaim control of a moment that had already escaped procedural boundaries. But it didn't matter. The exchange was over, and yet its consequences were only beginning. Because in Washington, and far beyond, this wasn't being interpreted as a disagreement, it was being seen as a turning point. For several long seconds after Kamala Harris finished speaking, no one moved, not the chairman, not the witnesses, not even Tim Scott, who remained still, his posture stiff, eyes fixed forward as though the weight of the moment had settled squarely on his shoulders. In Washington, silence often signals avoidance. But this silence meant something else. It meant the room understood exactly what had just happened. Scott had entered the exchange expecting dominance, seniority versus presence, longevity versus visibility. He believed experience alone would tilt the scales in his favor. What he hadn't anticipated was Harris's ability to strip the argument down to its foundation and expose the difference between speaking about leadership and practicing it. The committee chairman finally cleared his throat, attempting to restore order, but even his authority felt secondary now. The energy in the room had shifted beyond procedural control. Scott adjusted his microphone. "Madam Vice President," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice, "with all due respect, that characterization of my record is misleading." But the damage was already done, because Harris hadn't framed her response as opinion. She framed it as evidence. And evidence doesn't argue, it waits, Scott continued. "I've worked tirelessly for opportunity zones, for faith-based initiatives, for policies that empower individuals rather than expanding government dependency." The words sounded rehearsed. They also sounded defensive. Harris didn't interrupt. She allowed him to speak, which only sharpened the contrast between them. When he finished, she tilted her head slightly, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. "Senator," she said calmly, "I'm familiar with your talking points. Talking points, not principles, not outcomes, talking points. And I'm also familiar with how often they're used to avoid accountability." A murmur rippled across the room. This wasn't escalation through volume, it was escalation through clarity. "You mentioned opportunity zones," Harris continued, "but studies, including reports from the Treasury Department, have shown that many of those benefits flowed to developers, not the communities they were supposedly designed to help." Scott's jaw tightened. "And when communities asked for safeguards," she added, "those protections were voted down." She paused, letting the implication settle. "You talk about empowerment," Harris said, "but empowerment without access is just rhetoric." Before we continue, take a second and really sit with this moment. These exchanges don't happen often, where preparation meets pressure in real time. Before we continue, if this part surprised you, type truth in the comments, then let's keep going. Scott attempted again to reclaim ground. "I reject the idea," he said, his voice sharper now, "that conservatism is incompatible with caring about black communities." "And no one said it was," Harris replied instantly, "but voting against healthcare, education, and wage protections while claiming concern, that's a contradiction, not a philosophy." That line landed harder than anything else she'd said, because it wasn't accusatory, it was diagnostic. The cameras caught Scott blinking rapidly, the subtle signs of someone recalibrating under pressure. His earlier confidence, the easy cadence, the controlled authority, had evaporated. What remained was tension. Around the room, aides were already messaging colleagues, reporters were drafting headlines in real time. The exchange was no longer just happening, it was spreading. Harris leaned forward again, her tone softening just slightly. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "This isn't personal." That sentence alone carried weight. "This is about responsibility," she continued. "When we hold power, we don't get to choose which consequences matter. The people impacted by our votes don't experience them as ideology. They experience them as reality." Scott opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the exchange began, he didn't immediately have a response. The chairman tried again to redirect the hearing back to witness testimony, but the moment had already exceeded its boundaries. Everyone in the room understood that what they were witnessing would outlive the agenda. Harris finished her thought carefully. "You question my seriousness," she said. "But seriousness isn't measured by how long someone's been here. It's measured by what they're willing to confront." She leaned back, signaling she was done. The effect was immediate. Scott exhaled sharply, removed his hand from the microphone, and glanced down at his notes that now felt irrelevant. The posture of control he'd entered with was gone, the committee moved on, but the story didn't. Within minutes, Clips of the exchange were circulating online. Context didn't need explanation. The contrast spoke for itself. Political commentators framed it as a masterclass. Supporters framed it as overdue. Critics framed it as uncomfortable but necessary. And Tim Scott's initial question, "What have you actually done?" had been turned inside out, because now the question was being asked of him. As the hearing adjourned later that day, no one needed to speculate about what would happen next. The answer was already playing out across screens, timelines, and conversations nationwide. And the consequences were only beginning. By the time the committee hearing formally adjourned, the exchange had already escaped the confines of the room. What had begun as a pointed question had evolved into something far larger, an unfiltered moment of political clarity unfolding. Live, without rehearsal, without insulation. And Washington, a city built on controlled narratives, wasn't prepared for how quickly this one took on a life of its own. Within minutes, video clips featuring Kamala Harris were spreading across social platforms at a speed typically reserved for breaking news or scandal. This time, however, there was no ambiguity about what people were seeing. They were watching preparation dismantle presumption. Commentators didn't argue over who won, they debated how thoroughly. Cable news producers scrambled to reframe programming. Political analysts paused mid-segment to pull up footage. Even networks typically cautious around moments involving senior Republicans couldn't ignore what had just unfolded, because it wasn't spectacle, it was exposure. Scott's initial framing, that Harris relied more on presence than substance, collapsed under the weight of her response. And now the internet was doing what it does best, amplifying the contrast. On social media, the reactions split along familiar lines, but with an unusual consensus forming beneath the noise. Supporters praised Harris's restraint. Critics struggled to find an angle that didn't reinforce her point. Even those inclined to defend Tim Scott found themselves limited to arguing tone, not facts. And tone is a weak defense when the receipts are already public. Political strategists quickly recognized the danger for Scott. His brand, long cultivated as measured and unimpeachable, had taken a visible hit. Not because Harris attacked him personally, but because she forced a comparison he couldn't control. Experience versus effectiveness, seniority versus accountability. For years, Scott had benefited from occupying a unique position within the Republican Party. He was often presented as proof of inclusivity, a counterexample invoked whenever racial critiques emerged. That role came with influence, but also expectation. And now, under pressure, that expectation had turned inward. Commentary shifted from Harris's response to Scott's vulnerability. Why had he chosen that moment? Why that framing? Why that target? Insiders whispered what many already suspected. The move had been reactive, not strategic, a response fueled more by frustration than foresight. Behind closed doors, Scott's team entered immediate damage control mode. Draft statements were circulated. Advisors debated whether to escalate or retreat. Silence, once a strength, now felt like avoidance. Scott appeared later that evening in a brief media appearance, attempting to reframe the exchange as healthy debate. But the framing didn't stick, because healthy debate doesn't usually leave one side recalculating their future messaging strategy. Harris, by contrast, didn't tour studios. She didn't issue triumphant statements. She didn't post celebratory clips. She didn't need to. The restraint itself became part of the narrative. Observers noted how seamlessly the moment fit into her broader political arc. This wasn't improvisation, it was muscle memory. Years in courtrooms, hearings, and negotiations had taught her how to hold space without dominating it, and that skill translated. Progressive leaders praised the exchange as emblematic of a generational shift in democratic politics, less deferential, more prepared, and unwilling to absorb dismissiveness quietly. Moderates highlighted something else. Harris hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't personalized the conflict, she simply refused to accept the framing imposed on her. That refusal resonated. By the next morning, think pieces began circulating, not about the hearing but about what it represented. One prominent analysis framed the moment as a test of political evolution. Could traditional authorities still command respect without accountability, or had the balance shifted toward those who arrived armed with data, clarity, and the willingness to confront narratives head-on? Scott's allies attempted to reassert his record, pointing to legislation, initiatives, and long-standing service. But the attempt felt defensive, reactive, and most importantly, incomplete, because Harris hadn't denied his service. She'd questioned its impact, and that distinction mattered. As the story continued to spread, a deeper conversation emerged, one that extended beyond party lines. Discussions about representation, responsibility, and rhetorical power filled timelines and panels alike. For many viewers, the exchange wasn't about politics at all. It was about recognition. They saw a familiar pattern, someone in power questioning the legitimacy of someone else's voice, only to be met with preparation that refused to shrink. That's why the clip traveled beyond political spaces. It appeared in leadership forums, in professional discussions, in conversations about workplace dynamics and authority. The message was clear. Without being stated, credentials don't shield you from scrutiny, and confidence doesn't replace preparation. By the end of the week, polling analysts noted subtle shifts, not dramatic but telling. Favorability toward Harris ticked upward among undecided voters. Scott's numbers remained stable but showed signs of erosion among independents. It wasn't collapse, but it was consequence. Inside Washington, the lesson was already being absorbed. Younger lawmakers, especially women and lawmakers of color, took note. So did veteran politicians who had grown accustomed to unchallenged authority. The exchange had changed expectations, and as conversations turned toward what came next for both figures, one reality stood out. The moment wasn't an anomaly, it was a preview. In the days that followed, the exchange continued to ripple outward. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. What had unfolded in that committee room wasn't just replayed, it was studied. Law. Schools dissected Harris's response as a case study in controlled confrontation. Political strategists replayed Scott's opening question frame by frame, searching for the precise moment the exchange slipped beyond his control. Media analysts pointed to the same conclusion again and again. This wasn't about who spoke louder, it was about who arrived prepared. For Tim Scott, the moment marked a subtle but consequential shift. His standing within Republican leadership didn't collapse, but it narrowed. Invitations grew more selective, messaging became more cautious, advisors urged recalibration. The shield he'd relied on for years, seniority, symbolism, predictability, had cracked. Not because he lacked experience, but because experience alone had finally been challenged, publicly and cleanly. For Kamala Harris, the impact was different. She didn't gain power from the exchange, she confirmed it. Support poured in, not only from party loyalists, but from people who rarely engaged with political content at all. Emails arrived from educators, attorneys, healthcare workers, people who recognized something familiar in her response. The moment when someone questions your legitimacy, assuming authority will carry them through, and the moment when preparation quietly takes over. Before we continue to the final reflection, pause for a second. Moments like this resonate because they mirror real life more than politics. Before we continue, tell me, what part of this exchange hit you the hardest? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. This exchange had redefined the terms of political confrontation. The old rule book, where seniority demanded deference, no longer applied in the same way. Voters were watching differently now. They weren't measuring credibility by tenure alone. They were measuring it by clarity, substance, and composure under pressure. And Harris had delivered all three. Scott's original question, "What have you actually done?" had circled back, transformed. Because now the public was asking a broader question. What does leadership look like when it's tested? The answer didn't come in the form of a viral moment or a triumphant speech. It came through restraint, through preparation, through refusing to accept a narrative that wasn't rooted in fact. That's why the exchange endured. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. It showed how quickly authority can erode when it relies on assumption, and how power solidifies when it's anchored in readiness. Long after the headlines faded, the clip continued circulating, not as breaking news, but as reference. A reminder, a template for politicians, yes, but also for anyone who's ever been underestimated. The committee hearing itself faded back into obscurity, as hearings always do. Policy debates resumed, votes were cast, speeches were made. But that moment remained. A moment when preparation met opportunity, a moment when framing was rejected, a moment when the balance shifted, quietly, unmistakably, and perhaps that's the lasting lesson. In modern politics and modern life, credibility isn't inherited, it's demonstrated. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. Moments like this matter, not because they're political, but because they reveal something deeper about power, preparation, and standing your ground when it counts. If this story resonated with you, take a second to like the video. It helps these conversations reach more people. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's ever been underestimated, consider sharing this with them. Sometimes the right moment and the right preparation changes everything.